Sustainable Resilience with David Dodd.
It's my honor and privilege today to have a special guest, Dr. Laura Olson, who is renowned around the world in disaster recovery and resilience, and the first guest I've had on a full show of this production of this show, and I'm very happy to have you with me today, Laura.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to start with how you got into this field.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to bring you into disaster recovery and resilience?
Well, I lived and worked in Europe in the 90s, and I worked at NATO. I first wrote my master's thesis on the rapid reaction facility that the EU was trying to set up to respond to the Balkan War. And as part of that, I got involved with reconstruction efforts. And what happened with NATO was we had sent in troops, we had done a lot of bombing, and afterwards we tried to send in the same folks, our U.S. Army compatriots, to rebuild the same towns that had been bombed, and there was not a lot of reception in those towns for those efforts. And so I spent a lot of time looking at why and what that meant. Of course, it was obvious in some ways why, but that got me very interested in reconstruction, recovery, rebuilding, and specifically what it means when a community is torn apart and their social bonds are ripped a shred by any kind of an extreme event.
And that translated into work here, as we're in Louisiana right now.
Yeah, well, 2001 brought me back to the U.S. after 9/11 happened, and I began a PhD program studying disaster recovery. It really turned into a deep fascination. And after Hurricane Katrina, I came and worked for 5 or 6 years here with the nonprofit community, coordinating the efforts of 72 nonprofits to rebuild homes of those people who don't qualify for assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So we tried to pick up those who fell through the cracks, and we're doing a horrible job of it, just as everybody else was. I think after Katrina, the scope and scale took us by surprise, and so I brought data to the effort. Let's collect data on who's been impacted, what we're trying to do, who's trying to do that, and where the gaps are in what we're doing. And it turns out we didn't have real eligibility criteria. It was neighbors helping neighbors in a sense, meaning the nonprofit agencies here were peopled with survivors themselves, and their neighborhoods, 80% of the city was flooded, so they wanted to help the people from their neighborhood. If they were from Gentilly, they wanted to help people from Gentilly. If they were from the Upper Ninth Ward, they wanted to help people from their neighborhood. So we saw a lot of the criteria being who means something to me, because these are tightly woven communities. And that's not the way we can spend money in nonprofits, right? We have to have a real criteria that can serve everyone. So we brought in international best practices and instituted social vulnerability criteria for eligibility, and that was the first time that was ever used in the nonprofit community in the United States, which is shocking, but very true.
Right. And that social vulnerability index, that is now being utilized for recovery from the floods of 2016, which is why we're here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Tell us just a little bit about the social vulnerability index.
Well, the social vulnerability index is different than criteria that we use for nonprofits, because it's a quantitative data-driven set of analyses of factors in the census. It uses pre-disaster data collected in every census and updated in the American community survey each year, and it assesses about somewhere between 27 and 34 variables in each census tract, looking at economic data, racial data, ethnicity, level of education, all kinds of marginalization data. Do you belong, or are you kind of on the fringes, which is really what creates vulnerability in some sense. You're not kind of at the center of what we consider to be the norm.
Right.
You're falling outside that set. So we look at where that's occurring highest, and we can map that using GIS technology and really give ourselves very quick visuals after a disaster occurs of where we think the greatest impact is, and contrast that to where we think the highest vulnerability is. And when you overlay those two things, you know where you better get fast and where you can expect people basically not to recover without additional assistance. Who is going to be at the greatest danger of really falling into a condition of never recovering. And what that looks like is in disaster, and we don't talk about this in the U.S. very often, but a disaster takes somebody living kind of on the edges, just making it day to day. These are the working poor. They're employed to large extent. They're probably making a minimum wage, have a large family to take care of. They might be a single parent. They may be elderly, but they kind of live each day on this precipice, right?
Paycheck to paycheck.
Paycheck to paycheck, moment to moment. They live in a neighborhood, certainly in Louisiana, where they can call on a large social network that saves them from monetary expenditures. They can drop the kids off with auntie or grandma, and they make things work. A disaster happens and it's like falling off the cliff, right? That network is gone. All of the safety nets that people create through social connection with one another suddenly dissipate and disappear. And we find that people can't recover. They may lose their job because of the event. And we know that these are the people that typically won't stand up on their own again. Resilience is not a word we apply to this group.
Right.
So we have a very poor history in the U.S. of focusing on this group. FEMA and a lot of our federal agencies, because of the way we distribute funding, we kind of look at the middle of the road and those who are, you know, kind of our tax-paying population, and we need to focus on who's not recovering. So it's a shift in a paradigm that we're trying to promote. Let's think differently.
Well, and I was going to ask you the next question about international work, but we'll get back to that because this is a great segue into this method that you've developed, this methodology to really communicate clearly, and more importantly than communicate, listen to and hear survivors. And I've had the honor of working with you in Arkansas on this system, and it was wonderful. And can you just tell us a little bit about how that came about in your mind, how you came up with this system of active listening?
Sure. This derives from a method called participatory action research. And it's a long-term investment in the academic community to ask ourselves questions about how do we allow citizens to participate and have a real voice, not a
pseudo voice.
Pseudo voice, yeah, that's a good term, in their own recovery or in anything that's happening to them. If a democracy is about us all being able to express where we're at and what our needs are and what we believe in or do not, we have to include people's voices. And this is something that we tend not to do well either. And also is extraordinarily complex in a disaster landscape, right? Because you have huge numbers of people impacted. So this was built on studies beginning in the 1970s when people, I think some of the greatest work in academia was done on this notion of after the Vietnam War or during the Vietnam War, how do we express dissent, and how do we make our voices heard in a political situation where we might not normally be included. So it really comes out of a long tradition of trying to understand how to elevate people and make them part of a conversation. Neely Gardner is the method that I follow, his method. He was a famous public administrator for the state of California, and he pioneered how to, a cyclical process of how to empower the person in a situation of need to not be a victim anymore, but to be an agent of their own recovery, in a sense.
Very, very powerful. So we're going to take a break now for a couple of minutes, and then we'll be back with the rest of our conversation.
Man-made and natural disasters are taking an increasing toll on the world's population, affecting virtually everyone in every country around the world. Floods, hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, plagues, famine, population displacement, and added to that list, the latest man-made form of disaster, cyber attacks. Disaster recovery includes economic recovery, rebuilding clean water and sanitation systems, along with commercial and residential buildings and homes, transportation systems, also restoring education, health, and social services. But much more is required. We have learned that disaster preparedness is not enough. We have to go further, creating sustainable infrastructure, communities, and economies so that affected regions can bounce back more quickly, providing relief services in a timely manner, restoring infrastructure and jobs, and minimizing the impact of all forms of disasters on people's lives. For decades, we have depended on the public sector to come to our rescue. But in the face of record-breaking damage, that path is no longer sustainable. A new method of making places more sustainable is required. A new path must be created. The International Sustainable Resilience Center is creating that new path. The ISRC helps nations achieve this goal by developing private-public partnerships that help reduce the negative impacts of disasters. The center provides the framework to build sustainable economies and offers expertise in best practices and innovative approaches to help structure resilience-based public-private partnerships. The IRSC also helps integrate resilience and sustainability into all public-private partnerships through globally recognized expertise and experience. The ISRC has the potential to be a catalyst for realization of most, if not all, of the United Nations' 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The International Sustainable Resilience Center has the knowledge and resources to tailor virtually any project to become more resilient and sustainable, with reduced risk and cost for partners while increasing benefits to communities worldwide. Please donate to ISRC's Resilient 2019 campaign today and help make the world a more resilient and safer place to live.
Welcome back for our second segment of The Red Show with David Dodd with my special guest, Dr. Laura Olson. Laura, before the break, you explained the background of this methodology that we implemented in Arkansas. But can we talk a little about how that actualized itself in the aftermath of that disaster?
Right. So the way that it's implemented is, again, to try to choose and reach out to a larger community and give them a voice. In fact, not to have any voice at all ourselves as government actors in what a community wants to see in terms of their own recovery. So it's structured as a simple process to bring together. I do focus groups and groups from any sector or segment of society. You openly advertise those with the help of top government officials, schools, through different venues, Facebook pages that are set up after an event. And you invite people to sign up for time slots. They cannot just show up. And in that process, you record, you ask them different questions about what's working for them, what's hindering them, and then if they could change anything they want, what would it be? Which elicits basically projects that need to occur, how they need to rebuild their community. And you allow interactions to occur between the people as they discuss what's happened. So you have, it starts with a period of mourning, because before people can share with you, they have to trust you. And this process builds instant trust by allowing them to tell you what's been lost. And that seems to be a great need of any disaster survivor, to start at this point of, I had something beautiful and it was lost, and I need you to recognize and honor that fact. And by going through a process of teaching everyone involved what active listening is and how we can facilitate a conversation that allows that honoring of the momentous occasion to occur, people really open up and begin to can move beyond that mourning phase into the reconstruction phase, which is what's the work we need to do and to get done to move forward and out of this situation. So essentially, you're almost helping people process grief.
Wow.
In a sense, by walking through stages of what needs to be done and acknowledging what they've gone through.
So that first step, the acknowledgement of the loss and the grief, that's not been done very much in disaster recovery prior to this, correct?
No, and this method was designed in part with a set of psychologists that were looking at human nature and human behavior in critical events. If what we need to get to in order to empower people is a sense that they feel safe where they are and with whom they're talking to, that they have a voice and are serious partners to the process, how do we create a method or a process in which that can quickly unfold and occur?
Right. And being authentic as that point of communication, to me, was so critical, because we were in Arkansas, which is my ancestral home, and I was trying to connect with everyone and saying, oh, go Razorbacks. And you were sitting there saying, I'm Dr. Laura Olson, I'm from Minnesota. And people respected that. And they began to trust immediately that you were who you said you were. I think that is as important as any part of that methodology. And I think sometimes we try too hard to identify with the people that we're with, instead of allowing them to identify their loss and their grief. And it was a tremendous experience, and I want to thank you again for that. Moving on to a broader scale, what do you see in the whole movement of disaster recovery, resilience, all of that globally, especially given everything that's happening in our world today? Increasing numbers of disasters, increasing problems financially with many places around the world. What do you see happening?
Well, the trends are not, they're disturbing, right? We obviously all have identified a greater frequency of these events, greater intensity of them, so the destruction is worse. And the impact's worse. And so we have a different set of communities in the international sphere, and I'll speak from my other job, which is working with the United Nations on these issues internationally. We have three communities: the climate change adaptation community, we have a disaster risk reduction community, And then we have a disaster recovery community, and all three of them function separately and are not communicating well with one another. Although we're all realizing that there's overlaps in these areas and that they're going to need to come together if we're actually going to achieve some of our goals. We have a new set of frameworks in place, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction.
Right.
It is widely considered to be a large step back from the Hyoga framework for action because it's too all-encompassing. Maybe we were too inclusive in this process, so we kind of lost our goals along the way. So I'm about to head to the Cancun meeting, the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction, and think exactly about these issues and talk to others trying to implement in the field about these issues. How do we raise greater awareness? The truth is, again, if we come back to our vulnerable populations, if we're very, very honest about what their priorities are, they are not climate change adaptation, they are not disaster risk reduction, and they are not, until an event occurs, recovery. They are focused on the day-to-day difficulties they have in surviving.
Yeah.
Economic survival is what motivates people. When we look at a floodplain, we say, oh, what a dangerous place to live, or the slope of a mountain face, and they see fertile land and we see landslide danger. So, I mean, the ways of looking at the map or geographies are very different from a person, living a normal life and a disaster risk reduction professional. And we need to become more honest and more realistic about how to understand how people are making choices to live where they are. They're economically motivated choices, and they make sense for many of them because their means require them to live in dangerous situations.
How can we do that, though? How can we bring these different groups together and allow them to begin to communicate with each other in a meaningful way?
Well, I think events themselves are going to force that on us. We're already starting to see overlaps that some of the DRR community is integrating with the climate change adaptation community. There's resistance to this. I think it'll be a process of the next 2 decades, kind of bringing many groups together and bringing into the international development sphere a strong realization that disasters are the one thing that are knocking us back from every advance we make.
Yes.
I think, unfortunately, I wish there was an easy answer, but time and experience are going to force us into a position where we ourselves have to adapt to reality.
I cannot thank you enough for coming and allowing me to grill you with a few questions. It's deeply appreciated. Your insight is extremely valuable.